In the early days of video games, the last thing on a developer's mind was telling a story. The focus was on learning the rapidly evolving technology and harnessing its power to create a fun play experience for the player. As time passed, developers introduced basic plot elements into their games to help contextualize the mechanics and set up a purpose for the journey. These early video game plot points were bare bone, but they set forth an important precedent, that video games had the potential to tell stories. As early as the 1980s and 1990s, video games began delving into deeper narratives, ones that not only justified the mechanics and the world, but ones that could earn merit on their own. No longer were video game stories limited to providing a little extra motivation to complete the gameplay challenges, but instead they began to forge their own path with the advent of cutscenes that were completely out of the player's control. This pattern continued onward throughout the 2000s, and the scope and scale of these stories began to grow alongside the new technology and new systems. Eventually, developers realized that a game's narrative could be the driving force of the title, and that the gameplay could take a back seat. As the popularity of video games continued to grow and grow, studios began pushing the narrative quality further and further, and welcomed comparisons to full-length movies in an attempt to mark the validity of video games and their potential for great storytelling. Some studios did it subtly by having the player create their own narrative in the game, such as with 2012's Journey. In this game, players took the role of a desert nomad as he climbed a mountain. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, yeah, it was. But the developers also set up a world with intrigue and mystery that got players thinking about the events of the story, while also including an untraditional multiplayer component that let people experience the story together without the ability to interact or communicate. In this way, the story, in part, became whatever adventures players shared while on their journey. Meanwhile, developers like Telltale were experimenting with how games told narratives. They invited players into the writing room to a degree by allowing them to make choices, whether they came as simple dialogue cues or massive decisions that would alter the rest of the story, making each player's experience feel, quote-unquote, unique to them. Really though, these titles simply created an illusion of control, as the overall story structure existed on a scripted path that allowed for minor deviation from the player. These minor deviations were dressed up though in order to make the player's choice feel more impactful. At the end of the day though, every player experienced the same story, but with slight alterations. The developers tricked you into thinking you had more control than you did, in part by endearing you to the characters within the story, and then by forcing you to make tough choices about them. For example, in some cases you'd have to choose between two characters and make one closer to you while alienating the other, or in other choices you were forced to either let one person die while saving another. In this way, Telltale games involved the player into the narrative in a way that hadn't been done before. To me personally though, no game truly pushed the discussion around storytelling in video games to the level we see it at today until 2013 with Naughty Dog's The Last of Us. That's not to say that video games hadn't told stories before this, and great stories at that. It's just that this was the first game, in my memory at least, that really seemed to register across the industry and had people talking about the potential for narratives in games. Its focus on Joel and Ellie's relationship was the driving force of that title, and all its gameplay seemed to be subservient to that goal. Sure, roaming around killing bad guys and horrifying fungal zombies was thrilling, but ultimately it was about seeing what came next for Joel and Ellie and how their relationship grew and was tested along the way. The game's massive popularity got people talking, and since then, narratives in games have become almost as important as gameplay, whether it's in big AAA games or small indie titles. Since then, we've seen developers push their games' narratives to the limit in an attempt to garner comparisons to movies and prove the storytelling potential of games. 2013's Defiance attempted to have a video game run concurrent with a TV show, with events taking place in the game affecting the TV show, and vice versa. It never really took off though. And other games like Quantum Break featured full-length FMV cutscenes to accompany its gameplay, but again, it came and went without much more than a collective meh from the industry. In 2019, one game attempted to one-up the competition by making their movie into a video game, by having it take place almost completely in FMV, or full motion video. It harkened back to the 1980s when full motion video games were popping up in arcades and had many people believing that it was the future of the industry. That trend came and went, but we see it beginning to resurface today. And that brings us to the subject of today's video, the game I alluded to a moment ago, Erica, a full-motion, video-based game where the player is in charge of guiding the narrative as they attempt to solve a mystery and come to understand a bizarre set of characters and the mysterious events that are impacting them. It truly attempts to transcend the realm of video games and movies by combining them into one entity. However, by trying to be both, Erica's identity becomes muddled and fails to capitalize on the strengths of either movies or games. Since the title is a video game at the end of the day, let's start by breaking down how it fails to be a good one. Erica's gameplay is a more stripped down version of a Telltale series. In those games, you make dialogue options and major choices, but also participate in QuickTime events and minor puzzle solving. None of those latter two are found in Erica though. The gameplay consists of three facets. 1. Making dialogue choices for Erica. 2. Choosing which direction to send Erica as she navigates the environments. And 3. Very short interactions with objects in the environment. Needless to say, we are working with a very bare-bones set of mechanics that don't require any level of button skill from the player. You can interact with the game using a companion app on your phone, but a traditional controller works just as well, albeit with a tad more jank. I mean, there are times when you have to open a box or flick a lighter open, and you will feel like a complete dumbass as it opens and closes on screen as if the young girl's hands are impaired. This is mostly due to the fact that the PS4's touchpad seems like it's a little too short for this game. Your finger reaches the top of it before the box fully opens in some cases, and so it just kind of closes again and it looks ridiculous. You would never see something like this in a movie, and it results in this movie-like experience feeling clumsy, as if it's something off the blooper reel. Luckily though, interacting with environmental objects is the least player engaging component of the game. That's right, the meat of the game comes in the dialogue options and steering Erica. Does it fare much better? No. I had planned on playing through this game 3 or 4 times for this video, but I could only stomach going through it twice. I tried to play Erica completely different in both playthroughs, reserved, quiet, and obedient in one, and brash, bold, and rebellious in the other. This led me to choosing mostly different dialogue options on both playthroughs, but I was disappointed to see that my decisions ultimately didn't mean much. It reminds me heavily of that feeling I described earlier when talking about Telltale games, that overwhelming sensation that the promise of creating my own narrative isn't really true. The illusion of control can be so strong in the first playthrough, but fades quickly in the second. And this realization actually comes on quicker with Erica, because for an overwhelming majority of the time, she thinks, acts, and moves without the player's input. This leads to the player feeling even more out of touch with the experience than a Telltale game because they aren't in the driver's seat as often. During my playthrough, it became quite clear to me that many of the dialogue options resulted in the same reactions from other characters. Whether I played Erica as a timid girl or a pissed off one, the people around her really didn't change their reactions and perceptions of her. Take this cutscene here, where Erica has just experienced some traumatic shit and is talking to Blake, a detective working her case. No matter what option you pick here, Blake reacts the same way, with the most generic line I think I may have ever heard. By the way, the writing in this game is not superb.
Try and get some sleep. You'll be safe here, I promise you.
I just don't feel safe here.
It's okay.
We both know that's not true.
It's okay.
And the same issue impacts these sorts of choices when you have to choose which direction Erica will go in. It may seem like you'll be missing out on something monumental by going down one route, but this really isn't the case. You'll just end up in the next scene because the plot is still on rails. There are certain events that must go down, and the game isn't able to steer you to them seamlessly without losing a sense of player autonomy. In this way, your choices end up being not much more than flavoring to accompany the major beats of the story. Telltale games prove that this can work if it's done well, but here, the player has even less control than in those titles, making it all the harder to maintain the facade. The other issue with these choices and decisions is that if you want to explore the other option and see how it unfolds, you have to do a complete other playthrough. This game can be finished in about an hour and a half, but you'll still have to sit through the mandatory dialogue over and over again just to reach the point that interested you. It's a problem that other games have too, but it's made worse here because the player doesn't have enough control to justify more playthroughs. In other words, why would anyone want to sit through the same scenes over and over again just to see what was outside that window? By the way, it's just a stupid fox out there. That's it. An hour wasted for a fox. There's no promise that what you're missing out on is of any value or worth to the story. A fast forward button would have been very appreciated, that's all I'm saying. The only way your choices matter is in which ending you get, which sounds substantial. There are 6 different endings to the story, and I looked up all of them after realizing I couldn't sit through this experience anymore. Apparently, the choices you make throughout the story determine which ending you get, but really, I can't vouch for that. It seems like the only things that impacted which ending I received was the choices I made in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the playthrough. And for all of these reasons, Erica fails as a game. This is a good time to transition into looking at the experience more as a movie instead of as a game. While it might sound stupid to start by talking about the multiple endings, it highlights the true pitfall of this half of the game. Spoiler alert, none of the endings wrap up everything in a satisfying way that allows the player to understand the events that took place. Throughout the game, there's a mystery around Erica's father's asylum called Delphi House. Is it a rehabilitation facility where people are looked after and cared for, or is it a headquarters for a dangerous magical cult that seeks world domination? That's what you're trying to find out throughout the game, and while you can get some answers, there aren't enough details to satisfy the thought-provoking realizations that pop up in your head. By the time you finish a playthrough, you may feel like there's more questions than answers, and that's because there is. So right up front, the game tells you that no one playthrough contains all the answers, which is fair. Part of the game's worth is on its replayability factor, as each run only takes less than 2 hours. If the game told you everything on the first run, you'd probably never play it again, which may leave you feeling like your money was wasted. The problem is that, to me, it seems that no number of playthroughs will give you all the answers, especially when dialogue options usually result in the same reactions from other characters, and that choices on where to go usually lead to the same end destination anyway. Perhaps you can argue then that the game was meant to be this dreamlike experience filled with mystery and intrigue, and that's fine, but how in the world can the player draw any meaning from it if everything is left vague and unexplored? I couldn't imagine sitting through this experience a dozen times only to find no concrete answers after exploring all the various options and choices. Anyway, let's dial it back a bit. Movies are driven forward in one of two ways, either by its plot or by its characters, and sometimes it's both. The stories told in movies are about either putting interesting characters into certain situations to see how they react, or by creating an elaborate plot wherein the characters are experiencing the incredible events happening around them. So let's see which of these approaches Erica takes, since it strives to be a movie-quality story with its full motion video, scenes that involve very little impact from the player, and its multitude of characters. The characters within Erica are one note and aren't really fleshed out past their surface level. Detective Blake is a detective who wants to get to the bottom of Erica's father's murder. That's it. We don't know anything about his motivation or his backstory or his personality. He exists only to investigate Erica's case and serve as the trusty face of law enforcement. The trio of patients, Hannah, Toby, and Christy, also exist in one dimension. Hannah is the friendly face, Christy has the anxiety attacks, and Toby is the rebellious one. Sure, they all clash in personality, but each of them suffers from the same issues as Blake. They aren't interesting enough on their own and serve only to drive the plot forward. They're never given enough screen time to feel impactful. And this is the case for many of the game's characters, Erica included. She is a quiet and scared girl who barely ever speaks. She's much more content with giving side glances at other people and saying nothing of substance. Maybe this is a design choice, a somewhat silent protagonist that allows the player to take on the role to play her how they see fit. Again, this can be done well in games, but the problem here is that Erica wants to be a movie, and movies with silent protagonists don't really work. On top of that, because Erica is played by a real actor, there is way too much separation from how she behaves on screen and the moments when players are given dialogue options. She is always reserved, quiet, and anxious in moments that are out of the player's control, which makes the brash options presented to you feel out of place when you choose them. There's a massive dissonance between how Erica behaves and what a player can potentially choose. Anyway, I'm getting off tangent. Because the characters aren't interesting, it means this experience is a plot-central one, where the events taking place are supposed to be what lures the player in. The game gets kicked off with Erica learning from her father that she may possess an ancient magic that could allow her to see the future. Her father is murdered, and despite seeing the killer's face, Erica can't remember it. For years, she lives with trauma and anxiety about this event until one day, someone sends her a severed hand holding a medallion containing the same pattern that was carved into her father's chest. This incident reopens her father's case and forces Erica to move into Delphi House, the asylum her father opened alongside of this man named Lucian to help patients with a new type of therapy. As the events of the story unfold, it becomes quite clear that something is going on in Delphi House. It's a front for an ancient cult obsessed with fortune-telling and magic, which is interesting in theory, but it's done poorly in execution. Earlier, when I talked about how the game failed to deliver any answers, this is what I was talking about. We are never given enough information about Erica's father, or Lucian, or Delphi House, or the rituals, or the magic to make them feel impactful for the player. If this was a movie, you'd be so confused by the time the credits rolled because you never get a good grasp on what the hell is happening. Everything's just thrown at you in these one-off moments and aren't explored in any detail. And I don't want to spoil all the endings, but I will spoil one. In my first playthrough, where I made Erica ultra obedient, the game ends with a confrontation between Lucian and Erica. She has her father's colleague at gunpoint, but gets talked into lowering it and asks the man for psychological help, and he agrees to do so. The two hug, and we get a shot of a new painting, one that now includes Erica, and then the credits roll. That's it. I'm sure this isn't the ending that most players will get on a first run, but it's easily the least satisfying and most abrupt. If I was at the theater watching this, I'd be pissed and I'd be demanding my $8.50 back before leaving a terrible review on Metacritic. The point is, if you're welcoming comparisons to movies, then your game's story must be as compelling, as well-paced, as well-written, and as well-acted as them, and Erica simply isn't. It's a series of disjointed cutscenes broken up by the player's choices, featuring actors who aren't god-awful, but aren't that good either, and a plot that doesn't pay off in the end. And for all of these reasons, Erica fails as a movie. So what are we left with then? Erica fails both as a game and as a movie. Its mechanics aren't engaging or demanding of the player, nor do they lead to any different substantial outcomes that feel distinct from one another. Meanwhile, its storytelling sets up so many questions that are never paid off, making it feel like an incomplete movie, and this issue isn't relieved with subsequent runs. And combined into one entity, they make for a totally disjointed experience that has nothing going on for it past the surface level. There isn't anything deep or meaningful to be taken away from Erica in the same way as an incredible game or a fantastic movie. And yes, you can make the argument that I didn't explore every single option available in the game, and that's true. But if the first experience is so disjointed, so uninteresting, and so disconnected, why should I bother playing it again when I feel like it's wasting my time? And so, as I begin to wrap up this video, it seems to me that just like in the 1980s, full motion video games aren't going to be the wave of the future. It's nearly impossible to welcome the player into the experience by having something as concrete as full motion video that's already set in stone. At the heart of every good video game is player agency, and the issue here is that the rigidness of FMV leaves too much already accounted for without the player's input or control, leaving them feeling like an afterthought to the experience instead of being an active participant. Having me open a box doesn't make me feel like a part of the story on a gameplay level, and it's way too meaningless to carry weight in a movie. Presenting me with meaningless dialogue options and choices doesn't expand the experience because it creates dissonance in my mind. I'm in control of Erica's choices. Sometimes, but other times she's just gonna act under her own volition. These choices do allow you to participate in the story, but by doing so, the narrative suffers because it has to account for so many potential options instead of one concrete, excellent one. And so it seems to me that games and movies will never be able to successfully blend into one another as one cohesive experience that is actually good. You can improve on the formula that Erica uses, but at the end of the day, you can't tell a good, impactful, concrete, fully acted, and well-written story while also making the player's actions impact it in a super meaningful way. FMV games like Erica will always have this fatal flaw that leads to a full-blown identity crisis, and while I can appreciate its attempt to push game narratives closer to movies, I think it's best that we leave both medias to their own devices. If you enjoyed this analytical think piece on Erica and FMV games, consider checking out some of my other videos on the channel. I've really enjoyed taking some games and dissecting them in ways that are separate from my traditional reviews, and that's the case here. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter @NopeNatNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.